Each December, I welcome the end-of-year issue of Time magazine. I'm ever curious to see who the editors will choose as Person of the Year. I read, I learn, and I think. This year, as I'm sure many of you read, Time chose more than one person, selecting journalists Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post columnist who was murdered, two young Reuters reporters who are imprisoned in Burma, the founder and editor of a Philippine news site, and the Capital Gazette news team in Annapolis, Maryland. The link. All of these journalists were, in the words of Time, taking great risks in pursuit of greater truths, for the imperfect but essential quest for facts that are central to civil discourse, for speaking up and speaking out. Time editors explained that their choices were about courage, recognizing 4 journalists and 1 news organization who have paid a terrible price to seize the challenge of this moment, representatives of a broader fight by countless others around the world who risk all to tell the story of our time. For in reflecting on the year just ended, the editors explained, from Russia to Riyadh to Silicon Valley, manipulation and abuse of truth is the common thread in so many of this year's major headlines, an insidious and growing threat to freedom. Truth, freedom, courage. Reading about these journalists and many others who put their lives on the line constantly for the sake of truth and freedom, I'm humbled, awed, amazed, and proud. The person, or this year, the people of the year, challenge us. Challenges us to think about what is the truth we will stand up for. What are the truths for which we will seek, what are the truths we will seek out? And what are the truths we will speak out for, to defend, to protect? For even if we're not groundbreaking journalists, truth and freedom are challenges before us, and Jewish challenges for sure. We've just begun in recent days a new book of the Torah. We're in Exodus. Thus far in its opening chapters, we find Moses, the baby who grew up in Pharaoh's home, the young man who killed an Egyptian taskmaster for beating an Israelite slave, and the shepherd who's called by God to lead his people and go to Pharaoh on their behalf. When God first calls to Moses from the burning bush, God answers, Hineni, I'm here. But then, when God asks Moses to step up and lead the people, he's not quite so present. He attempts to avoid this responsibility. First he says, Mi anochi, who am I? Second, he says, and this is over a span of some time in Torah, what if they won't listen to me? They won't believe me. And third, he says, they won't listen to me. Moses, understandably, is fearful, not confident, and he frankly does not want this responsibility, does not think he's up to the task. But Moses is called to fulfill a task, a mission, if you would. Ultimately, as we know, with Aaron at his side and God supporting them out of sight, Moses accepts the call and takes on the responsibility. He goes to Pharaoh on numerous occasions, we know the story, and skipping a few steps, ultimately leads the Israelites out of Egypt to freedom. As we reflect on the events of Torah and the events of our world, particularly that of these journalists and others, I think there's an invitation for us to learn in our own lives. Note that in doing so, I don't want to minimize the sacrifices of these journalists, nor do I want to daunt any of us. But I invite you to consider Moses, his story, as a bridge to make what may seem to be a dramatic leap from these people of the year to us here in this sanctuary, this Shabbat. Consider Moses' question to God when he's charged with this great responsibility of leading his people and going to Pharaoh. He asks, Mi anochi, who am I? Moses was a shepherd. He couldn't imagine going to a king or leading a people. Our commentators unpack his question, not surprisingly. They say that Moses is asking, one thought is, how am I important enough? How am I worthy enough to speak to kings? And they say perhaps he's saying, even if I were important enough, how could I possibly get Pharaoh to listen to me? And who am I to free such a great people? In other words, Moses is questioning his own ability, his own stature, and maybe even his own self-worth as he faces this great task laid before him. The truth before him is that this is his people and they need to be freed. That truth, the awareness that he comes to, is part and parcel of the call before him. The truth of slavery confronts Moses with the call to responsibility, the call to act, the call which he is reluctant to assume. What Moses does is not so different from any of us. Well, we may not be called to rescue a large group from slavery single-handedly or close, but each of us faces at some point or another a call or calls, maybe from God, maybe not, a call or a truth of some size before us, small or large, that causes us to ask ourselves, who am I? Who am I to do this? Who am I to take on this responsibility? What impact can I have? Can I make a difference? At some moment in our lives, in our work, in our community, in our world, we've all asked that question of ourselves in some way, shape, or form, if not in those words. The truths that challenge us to question our own abilities are what I'm talking about. The truths that challenge us to question our own stature, our self-worth, or our ability to make a difference. Perhaps it's the truth about a relationship long neglected that may call us to be present in a new way, to pay attention, to apologize, to help heal a rift. Perhaps it's a truth about a wrong in our world which calls us to give of our time, our energy, our voices, and our resources. Perhaps it's a truth about ourselves, acknowledging how we treat our body or our soul, and challenging us, calling us to self-care. Or a truth about our work that calls us to approach our methods or our colleagues with a different understanding and patience. The truth about a truth about our Jewish lives that calls us to new learning and doing. Or the truth about issues that bother us, but we don't really know so much. That calls us to learn more, to listen to opposing views, to check our sources before we share information. Or perhaps it's a truth about freedoms in our world that are challenged and call us to defend them. Or a truth about misinformation that calls us to speak with honesty. The truths before any one of us may be singular at a given time, or manifold, or many. But we each have our own call in our homes, in our world, or somewhere in between. The key is to look and to listen. In some ways, we need to be like Moses. We may not have a burning bush around us, but is to stop. Moses stopped before the bush, and he noticed. Is to actually stop, look, and listen. Consider what is the truth that is calling each of us. So here we are at the beginning of a new secular year, a time when resolution making is a popular pursuit. So I invite you to take on this resolution, to look for truth and listen for its call. How do you start? We start with being honest with ourselves, asking ourselves, Mi anochi, who am I? What am I about? What are the principles and truths I live by? What will I fight for? What am I called to do? And then turn to those truths and act, for the truth requires commitment, but it is worth it.